Eleanor Vance prided herself on noticing things others missed, and what she noticed this chilly October morning was the gap where the tarnished silver candlesticks were supposed to be. The upcoming Thanksgiving Restoration Fundraiser, her fundraiser, depended on these historic pieces. Their condition and their presence was her personal responsibility. She bypassed the sanctuary, heading straight for the vestry. The storage room was as she expected, a mess, broken pews, old robes, clutter, disorder. It was precisely this lack of control that allowed things to go missing. Her eyes landed on the wooden crate in the corner, labeled in her own neat cursive, "Scrap, Historic." It contained the tarnished, broken silver and brass items she had deemed beyond repair. As she was doing a quick, frustrated count, the door opened silently. It was Marcus Cole, the church's part-time custodian, there to empty the trash. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," he murmured. "Mr. Cole," she replied, her tone sharp. She watched him. He was a quiet, tall black man in worn work pants, and his gaze, she noted, flickered for just a moment too long toward the scrap crate before he turned away. An instant, unpleasant suspicion formed in Eleanor's mind. She waited until he had left the room before turning back to the crate. She didn't need her list. She was certain of it. A small, broken candelabra was gone. It was worthless junk, but it was church property. And the man whose gaze had lingered just a moment too long was the only other person who had been in the room. Her mind, quick and decisive, made the connection. She stormed out of the vestry and looked through the stained glass window toward the parking lot. There it was, his truck, an old 1990s Ford Ranger, covered in rust and eyesore. It was, she thought with a surge of grim certainty, the perfect vehicle for hauling scrap. She watched as he loaded his cleaning supplies, but in her mind, she saw the glint of her missing candelabra hidden beneath his tarps. It was a small, insignificant piece of scrap, but Eleanor Vance did not tolerate things simply walking away. Suspicion, Eleanor believed, was just observation waiting for proof, and she intended to find it. Her mind kept returning to the empty space in that crate and the image of Marcus Cole's rusted truck pulling away. The next morning, she marched into Pastor Davies's office, ostensibly to discuss the fundraiser, but with a sharper agenda. The pastor's office was cluttered with books and pictures drawn by children, a space Eleanor found inefficient. Pastor Davies himself was a kind, gentle man in a worn cardigan, whom Eleanor found far too soft. "Pastor," she began, "I must insist we secure the items in the vestry. Even this scrap." "Oh, that." The pastor smiled warmly, leaning back in his chair. "It's a blessing you bring it up. I was just speaking with Mr. Cole. He said he might be able to use some of that old metal for a youth project. I told him to take whatever he wanted." A real relief to have it cleared out. Eleanor froze. The sheer naivety was staggering. "Use it," she repeated, her voice thin. This was worse than she thought. The man wasn't just stealing, he was manipulating the pastor's kindness. She saw this as confirmation. Marcus was using the pastor's softness to get away with theft. She decided, in that moment, that the pastor was a lost cause, too naive to handle this. Later that week, Eleanor was at the Maple Leaf Diner for her standing lunch reservation. The diner, with its red vinyl booths and the strong smell of coffee, was the hub of town gossip, though Eleanor participated only as an observer. She ordered the Yankee pot roast, a traditional New England meal, and surveyed the room. And there he was, Marcus Cole, sitting alone in a corner booth, reading a worn paperback. He was eating a simple bowl of soup and a side of crackers. Eleanor watched him over the rim of her coffee cup, which was, as always, too weak. He ate slowly, bothering no one, but to Eleanor, his presence felt like an affront. She watched as he finished, and went to the register to pay. He pulled a thin, worn wallet from his back pocket and paid with crumpled dollar bills and exact change. He left a small, but correct, tip in the jar. To Eleanor, this confirmed everything. He was poor, perhaps desperate. The sight of his rusted truck through the diner window parked 3 spaces down sealed it. That truck, in her mind, was the linchpin of his entire, sordid little operation. She decided the pastor had been duped. If the church's history was to be protected from this thief, she would have to be the one to gather the evidence. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was investigating. Suddenly, the motive seemed glaringly obvious, and it wasn't just scrap for cash, it was personal. The rusted truck. The pastor's naive blessing. It all painted a picture of calculated deceit. Eleanor's suspicion, which had been a simmering coal, now ignited into a cold, blue flame. She was leaving a tense fundraising meeting where she had to bite her tongue rather than expose the pastor's incompetence when she saw Marcus in the church parking lot. He was loading a heavy, canvas-wrapped object into the bed of his rusted truck. He struggled, just slightly, and the sound of metal clinking, a dull, heavy sound, reached her ears even from across the lot. It was the sound of evidence. He drove off, not toward the main road, but toward the east end of town. On impulse, Eleanor got into her Buick and followed. She told herself it was just an errand, but her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. She drove through his neighborhood, a stark contrast to her own manicured lawns. His street was lined with small, tightly packed duplexes and chain-link fences. It reinforced her entire narrative of desperation. Later that day, while picking up fundraising flyers from the print shop, a task she had to handle herself, she saw him again. This time, he was on Main Street, walking with a teenage girl. The girl, who Eleanor recognized as his granddaughter, Sarah, was dressed in second-hand jeans and worn-out sneakers, but her face was animated. She was clutching an old, dented saxophone case. Eleanor, parked at the curb, overheard Sarah's excited voice. "I just need the new valve, Grandpa, and I know I can get the scholarship. The audition is right after Thanksgiving." Marcus put his arm around her, his face a mixture of pride and, was that worry? For Eleanor, it was the final, sickening click of a lock falling into place. The aha moment struck her with the force of a physical blow. It all connected: the missing brass and silver from the church's sacred history, the heavy, clinking bag in his truck, the granddaughter who desperately needed an expensive instrument repaired for a life-changing scholarship. He wasn't just stealing scrap. He was stealing her church's history to fix a saxophone. She knew what she had to do next. She would follow him home from the church tonight. The drive to Marcus's neighborhood felt different this time. Eleanor Vance was no longer an observer. She was a prosecutor, and this was the night she would find her evidence. The cold November air whipped at her car, but she felt a hot, self-righteous adrenaline. She clutched her phone in her gloved hand, her thumb hovering over the number for the police, ready to report the theft. She parked her Buick Park Avenue, a gleaming, out-of-place luxury sedan, a block away from his modest house. The east end of town was quiet, the streetlights flickering. She pulled the collar of her expensive coat tighter, feeling like an intruder, but justified in her mission. Her heels clicked softly on the cracked pavement as she moved down the dark street, positioning herself behind a rickety wooden fence that overlooked his backyard. Her target was the small, detached garage. A dim light glowed from its grimy window. She peered through the glass, her breath fogging it slightly. The interior was dim, lit by a single bright work lamp and the blue-orange flame of a small forge. She saw the glint of metal and braced herself, expecting to see the church candelabra, ready to be sold for scrap. But she didn't. What she saw stopped her cold. She did not see a pile of stolen church artifacts. Instead, she saw a professional-grade artisan's workshop. It was immaculate. Tools she didn't recognize hung on a pegboard in perfect, obsessive order. Sketches of intricate designs were tacked to the wall. And she saw Marcus. He was not a custodian. He was an artist. He wore a heavy leather apron and protective goggles, and he was skillfully using a small hammer to shape a piece of glowing metal. His movements were precise, economical, and filled with a grace she hadn't thought possible. Her eyes darted to his workbench. There was the saxophone, now partially disassembled, its dented bell being meticulously repaired. Next to it were not stolen church items, but other restored pieces, a child's silver cup, a small brass music box. She realized, with a dawning sickening horror, that he was using the scrap from the church, the worthless, broken pieces the pastor had given him as raw material to create new valves and parts. Leaning in, her mind reeling, Eleanor accidentally knocked over a metal trash can that had been left outside, making a loud, unforgivable clatter in the night. The forge went quiet. The garage door creaked open. Marcus stood there, silhouetted against the light, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked right at her, his face not frightened nor angry, but deeply, profoundly weary. "Mrs. Vance," he asked, "are you lost?" For the first time in decades, Eleanor Vance was speechless. She was not lost. She was simply, terribly wrong. His question, "Are you lost?" hung in the cold night air, a gentle rebuke that highlighted the true nature of her trespass. The silversmith's secret was standing right in front of her, in a leather apron. Marcus sighed, a sound of deep, old exhaustion, and gestured with his hand toward the open garage. It was an invitation, a simple act of politeness that felt, to Eleanor, like a profound judgment. She stepped inside, her expensive shoes grating on the concrete floor. The smell of solder, polish, and machine oil filled the air. This is a workshop," Eleanor stammered. Her prosecutorial air was gone, replaced by a quiet, trembling shock. She looked at the immaculate tools, the technical sketches on the wall, and a beautifully crafted silver bracelet resting on the bench. Marcus nodded, his dignity intact. He pointed to the saxophone. "My granddaughter Sarah. She has an audition for a scholarship. The horn, it needed work." He gestured to the other items, the child's cup and the music box. "The neighbors. They can't afford repairs. I help where I can." He looked at her directly. "The scrap pile at the church. Pastor Davies said it was destined for the dump. He said it was a sin to waste good metal. I only take what is broken, Mrs. Vance." Eleanor, finally seeing the real man, asked the obvious, trembling question. "Why are you a custodian? You are an artist. A master." Marcus looked down at his own hands, calloused and stained. He was silent for a long moment, as if deciding whether to share a pain he had long since buried. "I was," he said, his voice quiet. "A long time ago. Had my own shop downtown. Guild-certified silversmith, back in the 70s. He paused, his gaze turning inward. "But word got out who was making the jewelry. I had a prominent customer, a white family, come to pick up an heirloom. They saw me. They didn't want my hands on their family silver." He exhaled slowly. The word spread. Business dried up. People in this town wanted the craft, but not the craftsman, not if he looked like me. I took manual labor jobs. Had to provide for my family. The workshop, it just became a secret. Something I did in the dark." Eleanor looked at her own pale, ring-adorned hands, hands that had only ever judged. Then she looked at his hands that could create beauty, that could mend what was broken, but had been rejected for their color. The weight of her own prejudice, and the crushing, systemic prejudice he had faced, crashed down on her. "I came here tonight to accuse you," she confessed, her voice small, her shame absolute. I don't know what to say." Guilt, Eleanor knew, was useless. It was a self-indulgence. Atonement, however, required action. The next 2 weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were a blur of activity for her, but not for the fundraiser she had originally planned. It was for something new. She first addressed the stunned church board at a formal meeting. She announced she had found the perfect artisan to restore the church's entire silver collection. When she named Mr. Marcus Cole, the room was stunned silent. Eleanor stood, her voice steady. She explained, without revealing his most painful personal details, that Mr. Cole was a master silversmith who had been forced to abandon his trade decades ago due to a great injustice. She did not spare herself. "I, too, fell victim to this judgment," she said, her voice clear. "I saw a custodian, not an artist. It was a failure of character and a sin of assumption." She then formally proposed that the fund hire Marcus at a master artisan's full rate, not just to restore the collection, but to establish a new apprenticeship program, with Sarah as his first student. The board, moved by Eleanor's uncharacteristic passion and profound confession, agreed unanimously. The final scene took place on the Sunday after Thanksgiving. The church was packed for the community dinner. At the front, gleaming on the altar under the lights, was the entire restored silver collection. It shone with a brilliance no one had seen in a lifetime. Marcus Cole sat in the pews, not in his work clothes, but in his best, but older suit, with Sarah beside him. Pastor Davies rose. He publicly thanked our own artisan, Mr. Marcus Cole, for his work, for bringing their history back into the light. And then, led by Eleanor Vance from the front pew, the entire congregation rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Later, at the dinner, Eleanor walked over to Marcus, holding 2 plates, each with a slice of her grandmother's pumpkin pie. She didn't apologize again. She just looked at the gleaming silver on the altar. "Your work is magnificent, Mr. Cole," she said softly. He nodded, a small, dignified smile touching his lips. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance. It was good to bring it back to the light." Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile, and looked at Sarah, who was holding her now gleaming, perfectly repaired saxophone. "Now, Sarah, about that music scholarship fund." The story of Eleanor and Marcus reminds us that prejudice often clouds our vision, causing us to see only the rust while missing the silver beneath. Just like a master silversmith, kindness has a way of restoring what is broken and bringing hidden brilliance back into the light. When we set aside our judgment, we open the door to true compassion, and we may discover the profound, hidden talents within our own communities. Perhaps take a moment today to truly see the people around you and consider sharing that warmth with those who may need it.